it's Rondale Moore, who we love. And he said a bigger role, there's no doubt. Last year, just with the numbers with Christian, AJ Green, Hop, he kind of got lost in the shuffle more than he should have. He's a dynamic playmaker. With Christian leaving, we expect him to fill that role. And then in another tweet, Jamie goes on to note that Kingsbury said, we're going to try to give him the ball more. You've seen what Kyle has done there with Debo. He finds different ways to give him the ball. We're going to be creative with Rondale because when he touches it, good things happen. Obviously, the Debo comps are just so on the nose that you kind of expected that. What I thought was really interesting here was this comment that with the numbers of the guys ahead of him, he kind of got lost in the shuffle. This is something, if you read Stealing Signals last year, if you listened to Stealing Bananas, Shawn, you and I talked about a ton. This was something that I was really kind of harping on throughout the year where, I mean, certainly there was a reason for it. Christian Kirk's slot rate was incredibly high. He played really well out of the slot last year. And Rondale Moore, the vast majority of his snaps were coming in the slot as well. And so he was sort of a direct backup to Kirk. There was the one game where they kicked Kirk outside when both Green and Hopkins were out, and Moore got a lot more playing time in the slot in that game. But then when Green came back and Hopkins was still out, they started playing Antoine Wesley on the outside. They didn't want to keep Kirk outside. It was clear. They moved Kirk back to the slot. They had Wesley playing a ton, and they still had Moore in sort of this background role, which was very confusing, in my opinion. I think you needed to kick Kirk out and get your best players on the field. But this idea that he got lost in the shuffle, it's something that I talked about earlier in this offseason in Stealing Bananas. I think I said that they were sort of the victims of their own success in this way that AJ Green, I mean, a lot of these guys were really efficient early on before Kyler Murray's injury. He was playing really good quarterback, and all of the pass catchers in Arizona were efficient in the early part of the year. AJ Green was performing at a certain level that was really, strong for him compared to his 2020. Even when they brought in Zach Ertz, he immediately started performing really well. Christian Kirk obviously was performing well. My comment about them being sort of the victims of their own success was that you get into sort of the sequencing thing where, AJ Green's range of potential production on a weekly or season-long basis, there's going to be spikes and things like that. Because they hit on some of these spikes early on, I felt like it was a little bit of sort of a mirage, but they thought that they needed to go with that lineup that they had, but that ultimately that lineup was capping the overall ceiling of their pass offense because they weren't finding ways to incorporate Moore, who did come out and be efficient early on. He had this really weird season where he has a huge chunk of his receiving yardages in the first 3 or 4 weeks. I can't remember the exact stat. I tweeted it a couple months ago, but he had, I don't know, a couple 300 receiving yards in the first couple weeks, and he finished with 600 for the whole year, the next 10 or 11 games, because all he was getting after that point was these touches near the line of scrimmage, and he didn't really create any more explosive plays, but he did create a couple early on in the year. But because everyone was so efficient, they kind of just decided that the guys they had out there were the right guys to have on the field, and they kept going forward with that. And then you have guys like AJ Green and Zach Ertz down the stretch that are blocking routes for Rondale Moore, who clearly has more explosiveness and brings a more dynamic element to your offense. I think that was a problem for them late in the year, especially when Kyler was a little bit more banged up after his injury. Wasn't necessarily always the same. Going into the playoffs, you now don't have as much dynamism in your offense overall as if you maybe around week 8, week 10 made a more concerted effort to get Rondale Moore involved in a heavier way, because you see that he's a playmaker and you need playmakers in your offense. That was sort of my take on Arizona's offense all year. I mentioned this back in January. So for me, this is sort of a victory lap or confirmation bias or whatever. But to hear Kingsbury flat out say, just with the guys ahead of him, Rondale got lost in the shuffle more than he should have. And to say that he's a dynamic playmaker, and to say also with Christian Kirk leaving, we expect him to fill that role. Those are exactly the things that I wanted to hear from Cliff Kingsbury. It's March, but those are exactly the things that I wanted to hear from him.
Yeah, and some of the things we don't always hear, because it really is an admission that Kingsbury made some mistakes. And that can be hard to do, especially when you're a little bit under fire. It also be a smart thing to do, because people do want to hear that you are willing to admit that you should have done some things differently, and maybe that you're going to evolve in terms of what you're doing. One of the things I pointed out about the Cardinals last season is I thought they showed a lot more flexibility in terms of how they use their receivers than they had the previous couple of years. And you can see those types of things when you pull up the Cardinals in the Player Stat Explorer and look at their location charts. And yet at the same time, they didn't go far enough in terms of getting their best players involved. And I think that the order that things happened in, exactly like you mentioned it, did play a role, because they came out with everybody healthy. and this healthy combination of Murray to Hopkins. And really, when those guys were 100%, still this elite combination, one of the very best in the NFL. Maybe not Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill, maybe not Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, obviously two that we no longer have. But at the very top in terms of how dynamic those guys are and how effective it was in the offense and how well the Cardinals were moving the ball, that allows the secondary players to play off of them in Green and Kirk. And then you're thinking, okay, well, especially if we're going to have Ertz in here at some point, then there just simply isn't that role. I mean, you've got to start preparing your best players to be out there and to be, winning the Super Bowl. And there's no excuse for, even if they had stayed healthy and they didn't need him as much as they inevitably did and didn't have him ready for, you would have wanted that weapon at your disposal as you go into the playoffs. If they're a number one seed as opposed to a cratering team, either way, you need to have that element, and they did not have it, right? And you mentioned, again, the Murray injury. That's exactly the element here, I think, that was sort of the final piece in terms of just cutting off Moore's rookie season at the knees, because by the time that they realized, okay, we need to kind of get some of these guys involved, Kyler Murray wasn't the same guy. And so the offense simply didn't work, even if they could have made some of those other things happen. And again, we saw them collapse, but that piece should have been used earlier. It is great to hear that he's going to be a big part of what they do in 2022, because you can't just kind of go back to the beginning now and completely replace everybody, right? I mean, they're looking at a team where it needs to be Murray. It's going to be Connor. Hopkins, you hope, is healthy, but then for it to work, it's got to be Rondale Moore, and he's still one of the fastest players in the NFL, one of the best players with the ball in his hands. We saw flashes with him, and that's very different from one of our other favorite players in Laviska Shenault, where as opposed to the coaches saying, look, we need to do a better job, there is more of this element where he's been blamed for the problems that they've had. Now he's on the trade block. There are a lot of people in the NFL who supposedly still think that he can be not just a starter, but perhaps even a star player as a niche player, at least, that within what he can do, he can be a game changer. But his own team isn't necessarily coming out and saying that, and hasn't really at any point. And when you watch their games, he's made mistakes that jump out. Whereas when you watch the Cardinals, every time that Moore touches the ball, you think, yeah, this guy needs to be more involved. And again, even players who, finish the year with 200-300 receiving yards and are out there all the time, but a lot of those guys have highlights where you can look at it. If that was the only play you saw, you think, well, maybe this is a 1,000-yard receiver. But with a rookie, and especially a rookie that the coach is admitting he misused, we talk about all the time those couple of just amazing flash plays to where that's not the kind of guy where you're thinking to yourself, okay, he's going to be used within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage his entire career. There's a lot more to it. He's going to take the next step. And that's why I think you should hold and buy if you can. But I mean, more you can't get for him in a trade right now, what you're going to be able to get in 8 months.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about the sort of the explosiveness, and you and I both watch an absolute ton of football, but also tend to lean more towards the numbers and understand long-term trends and things. Moore wasn't as productive in year one as you like to see. It kind of puts him in a concerning bucket. And yet I am relying on sort of my eyes on this, because when you were talking about that just now, I'm thinking of how many plays I watched. And obviously I was watching more closely, and I'm biased and I'm a big fan, and I had him on a lot of teams and was waiting for the breakout to come, especially waiting for him to hit on some explosive plays in the limited role to sort of force the hand more. Because during the middle of the season, when he was losing that playing time, he didn't quite hit on as many plays as maybe that would have forced the hand more a little bit. I still think it was more a mistake on Kingsbury's part, because he had shown that right away in the first month. He made a couple really nice plays, and not just explosive plays. He made a nice catch on the sideline on a downfield pass that I've referenced probably 50 times, but it was just a really nice play on the sideline. What I was going to say is the film watching thing is, every time Moore touched the ball, I was anticipating him exploding. There are guys that you can see have that juice. And it's like, I guess the guy that immediately comes to mind is, people have said this about Tony Pollard for years. And then other people who, I don't want to say don't watch the games, because now I'm starting to sound like a film truther, but other people who are focused perhaps solely on production to a fault, which we are very, very focused on production. So I don't even want to necessarily say that's to a fault, but I've seen the pushback from people that are very like-minded to me on guys like Tony Pollard over the years that are like, what has he actually done? He's made some plays, but like he's not getting the usage he needs, and he's maybe not had the production. And the reason I bring him up is last year we saw him start to hit for some of those explosive plays that were evident to everyone. You know, he's sort of an enigma where everyone was like, this guy looks really, really good. We saw the kick return touchdown on Thanksgiving, I think it was. We saw some of his explosive runs. Him hitting on a few more like 30-yard touchdown runs last year for Pollard. That's the stuff that I felt like was going to happen every time Rondale Moore touched the ball. I mean, obviously, again, as a bias and positive viewer of everything that he's doing, rose-colored glasses, if you will. But I felt like the way that he's taking the ball, his explosiveness, yes, he's small. You can see that evidently. But like if he gets a little seam, he's going to be, you know, he's got that burst where he's the type of player that can pick up chunk yardage quick. And he did that on the one play early in the year where he had like a 70-yard touchdown. I think it was his only real long TD. I don't know if it was even 70, but he caught like a crosser and made a couple weaving plays. And
we're not giving up on these Steve Smith comps yet.
What's that?
We're not giving up on these Steve Smith comps yet.
Right. We're not giving up.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.